At exactly 3:17 a.m., I woke up to a blaring alarm, the sound of tires screeching, and the blinding flash of blue and red lights bouncing off my bedroom walls. I stumbled to the window, heart pounding, only to witness something that looked like the opening scene of a Hollywood raid. Armed officers stormed the street with precision, barking commands through radios. But that wasn't the shocking part. The real gut punch? My Jeep, the same one I'd locked and parked in front of my property per very specific instructions from the local police task force, was gone. Vanished. And in its place, a bright orange parking cone with a sticky note on it that read, "Code violation. HOA confiscated." I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or laugh at the absurdity of it. Karen from the HOA had just cut the lock off a law enforcement vehicle and towed it to who knows where, like it was an abandoned mattress. She had no idea she just torched a months-long surveillance operation. And now, with federal agents standing outside asking me where the Jeep was, I realized something horrifying. I had to explain to the government that my Jeep was stolen by a neighborhood association president. Moving into Willow Creek Estates was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of serving overseas and bouncing between cities, I was ready to put down root. I wanted peace and quiet, a backyard for my dog, and a garage big enough to rebuild motorcycles in. And for the first few weeks it was perfect. Neighbors waved, kids played in the cul-de-sac, and everything smelled like barbecues and fresh mulch. But peace, I would learn, has one mortal enemy: Linda Farthington, the HOA president, known among locals as Karen Supreme. She wasn't just a stickler for the rules, she was the rules. If your grass was a half-inch too tall, she left a fine on your door. If your Halloween lights stayed up past October 31st, you got a written warning. And if you drove a rugged black Jeep with military-grade blackout plating and reinforced bumpers like mine, you were apparently committing a war crime. The first time Karen saw my Jeep, she pursed her lips so hard they practically vanished. "That doesn't belong in this neighborhood," she said, staring at it like it had just insulted her mother. "It looks like it escaped a demolition derby." I tried to be civil, explaining that the Jeep was part of my consulting work with local law enforcement. She scoffed and said, "Nice story, soldier boy. Next time try a Honda like a normal person." From that point forward, she became obsessed. Every week, I'd get passive-aggressive letters about unauthorized vehicle modifications, excessive tactical aesthetics, and my personal favorite, parking intimidation. Who knew a parked Jeep could commit psychological warfare? What Karen didn't know, because she was too busy memorizing HOA bylaws to pay attention to reality, was that the Jeep had recently been outfitted with covert surveillance equipment. A task force had approached me, asking to use my parked vehicle as a fixed surveillance node for a sting operation targeting a drug ring that had infiltrated our supposedly peaceful community. My Jeep was equipped with remote cameras, GPS trackers, and a digital recording unit. It was essentially a spy truck, and because of its intimidating look, it blended in without drawing attention from suspects. The irony? Karen's disdain for it was the exact reason it had been chosen. Of course, I didn't advertise this to the neighborhood. The fewer people who knew, the better. I followed the task force's instructions to a T. Keep it parked in front of the house, rotate its angle slightly every few days, and for heaven's sake, don't move it without notifying them first. I even added a heavy-duty security lock on the front wheel, both to prevent theft and to make it very obvious that this wasn't some junked vehicle collecting rust. That didn't stop Karen. Apparently, the sight of the lock sent her into a power-tripping spiral. She reported the Jeep 5 separate times, each time escalating her complaints to abandoned vehicle status. No matter how many times I told her it wasn't abandoned, no matter that it was parked legally on my own property, she insisted she had the right to deal with neighborhood hazards. And one afternoon, after I left to run errands, she acted. Karen brought in a private tow service, one that clearly didn't ask many questions. But before they arrived, she marched up to the Jeep, bolt cutters in hand, and snapped off the lock like she was breaking into Fort Knox. My neighbor Rick, who lived 2 doors down and practically lived on his porch with his Ring cam rolling 24/7, recorded the whole thing. In the footage, she smirks directly into the camera after cutting the lock and says, "One less eyesore to worry about." By the time I got home, the Jeep was gone. At first, I thought it had been stolen, until I saw the cone and the note. I knocked on Karen's door, but she refused to answer. Instead, she sent a formal email, stating that the HOA has relocated the non-compliant vehicle to prevent visual pollution and ensure community standards. It was so ridiculous I laughed, until I remembered what was inside the Jeep. I called the police task force immediately. They didn't laugh. In fact, they were at my door within 30 minutes, asking me to walk them through everything. By the time I showed them the footage, the color had drained from Officer Melendez's face. She cut the lock?" he asked, voice clip. "And towed the Jeep without authorization?" I nodded, already sweating bullets. "We're talking about tampering with federal surveillance equipment. That's obstruction at minimum." That's when the mood shifted from annoyed to nuclear. The officers launched an emergency retrieval order, but the problem was, we had no idea where Karen had stashed the Jeep. And it wasn't at any of the local tow lots. They checked. This meant she'd taken it somewhere private. Off record. Probably illegal. And all the while, the sting operation the Jeep was monitoring? It had to be called off. The suspects had gotten spooked. A months-long operation dismantled by an HOA busybody with a vendetta against off-road vehicles. And that's how I found myself standing on my porch at 3:17 a.m., watching a task force deploy without its surveillance vehicle. With officers furious, suspects on the run, and Karen nowhere to be found, one thing was clear. She had no clue what she'd done. But when the full weight of the law finally caught up to her, oh, she was going to wish all she'd done was complain about my grass. The next morning started with a text from Officer Melendez that simply read, "We found the Jeep. You're going to want to see this." My stomach flipped. I barely had time to throw on a hoodie before he pulled up in an unmarked black SUV, motioned for me to get in, and said nothing the entire ride. I could tell from his clenched jaw that whatever we were about to walk into wasn't just bad, it was absurd. We drove 10 minutes through winding back roads until we arrived at a large rusted gate behind an HOA maintenance shed I'd never noticed before. Melendez stepped out, walked up to the keypad, and gestured for me to look at the open padlock hanging on the gate like a forgotten afterthought. Inside the lot was a fenced-off area, overgrown with weeds and half-filled with cones, tarps, and 3 other cars, each with parking stickers peeled off and tickets fluttering on their windshield. And there it was, my Jeep, scratched, dirty, and sitting crooked like it had been unceremoniously dumped. The driver's side mirror was cracked, and the small black case housing the encrypted surveillance drive was wide open, gutted. I just stood there in stunned silence while Melendez swore under his breath and started taking photos. "This isn't a tow lot," he muttered, kicking aside a cone. "This is a private HOA graveyard. This woman's running her own impound operation out of a damn utility shed." I walked around the Jeep slowly, taking in the damage. There were scuff marks on the wheel wells, mud jammed into the suspension, and someone had clearly tried to pry open the glove box with a screwdriver. It was like watching someone desecrate a tombstone. Melendez called it in, requesting backup and a federal evidence team to come secure the vehicle. Then, as if summoned by our collective anger, Karen herself showed up, clip-clopping in heels through the gravel like she was arriving at a garden party. "Oh good, you found it," she said cheerfully, as if this were all part of some organized lost and found. "I was about to notify you, but I assumed you knew the HOA was within its rights to." Melendez didn't let her finish. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." Karen blinked, confused by the sudden shift in tone. "Excuse me? I am the HOA president. I have full authority to remove any unauthorized or unregistered vehicles that..." You removed federal surveillance property from an active operation, Melendez snapped. Do you understand how serious that is? Karen's face twisted into a mixture of smugness and disbelief. You can't be serious. That thing was a visual nuisance. I thought it was abandoned. It had a giant lock on it and was parked in the same spot for weeks. Honestly, I did you all a favor. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She sounded like she expected a thank you. Melendez motioned for one of the officers who had arrived to escort her away while the rest of the team examined the Jeep. She didn't go quietly. She kept talking loudly about how she'd saved the neighborhood from an eyesore and done what no one else had the guts to do. Every word just dug her deeper. As they took her away for questioning, Melendez turned to me and asked if I had any security footage from the moment she towed the vehicle. I pulled out my phone and showed him the ring cam video my neighbor Rick had given me. It showed Karen in broad daylight, walking up with a pair of bolt cutters and slicing through the wheel lock like it was a zip tie. The tow truck she called didn't even have official markings. It was some budget operation that probably got paid in cash and didn't ask questions. In the footage, she laughed while the Jeep was dragged away. That laugh was going to haunt her. By the end of the day, the task force had what they needed: video evidence, an eyewitness timeline, and now, an entire illegal tow yard run under the guise of HOA enforcement. But just when I thought the day couldn't get more surreal, Rick strolled up with a lawn chair and a cooler, looking way too cheerful for someone watching a crime scene. So, he said, popping open a soda, you gonna tell her she messed with the feds, or should I put it on Facebook first? Apparently, Rick had been archiving everything. Karen's letters, her bizarre rants at HOA meetings, even the way she'd bragged in the community Facebook group about cleaning up the streets one rusty heap at a time. He had a whole file of screenshots and ring cam clips cataloging her behavior, and he offered them up like he was donating to a museum. I always knew she'd implode, he said, grinning. Just didn't think she'd do it by stealing a government Jeep. The best part? The HOA had no idea any of this had happened. Karen had acted entirely on her own authority. She never called a board vote, never filed the paperwork, never issued a formal notice of vehicle removal. It was all rogue action, driven by personal spite and a ridiculous need for control. When word started to spread among the other residents, the reactions ranged from disbelief to barely contained celebration. One woman even brought out a tray of cupcakes with blue and red frosting shaped like tiny tow truck. That evening, I got a call from Detective Sasha Lin, who was leading the task force. She was calm, but there was a razor edge to her voice. "We're evaluating charges," she said. "Tampering with federal property. Interfering with a surveillance operation. Possibly obstruction of justice. Her HOA authority doesn't protect her from any of that." I asked what would happen next. "Well," she said, "once we finish processing the damage and reviewing all the footage, we're turning this over to the DA. In the meantime, you may want to prepare for the fallout. People like her don't go down quietly." She was right. The next day, a notice was taped to every door in the neighborhood. Karen had called an emergency HOA meeting. Not to apologize, not to explain, but to justify herself. According to the notice, she planned to clarify her actions in light of recent misunderstandings regarding community safety and federal overreach. The audacity was unreal. She was gearing up to spin this as her being the victim. And she hadn't even seen the rest of the evidence yet. I knew then that things were only going to get messier. But what Karen didn't realize was that the walls were already closing in. And at the next meeting, she wasn't going to be holding the gavel, she was going to be sitting in the hot seat. And this time, there'd be more than angry neighbors and cupcakes. There'd be lawyers, officers, and subpoenas. Lots and lots of subpoenas. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Friday evening, and by the time it rolled around, the community center was packed. Not just with angry residents, but with reporters, legal observers, and a few very serious-looking people in dark suits who clearly weren't there for the free cookies. The room buzzed with tension as everyone waited to see what Karen Farthington, the once untouchable queen of suburban pettiness, had to say for herself. She arrived 15 minutes late, wearing a bright red blazer like she was hosting a game show instead of standing at the edge of a legal cliff. With her clipboard in hand and a smug little smile on her face, she walked up to the front of the room, nodded at the board members sitting stiffly behind the long table, and tapped the microphone twice like she was warming up for a TED Talk. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, voice syrupy sweet. "I want to address the recent incident involving the removal of an illegally parked, unregistered vehicle from our street. There has been a great deal of confusion, misinformation, and frankly, hysteria surrounding this event." Someone near the back snorted. "I was pretty sure it was Rick." Karen continued, undeterred. "As your HOA president, I take our community's safety and aesthetic standards very seriously. When I saw an unsightly, clearly abandoned Jeep parked for days on end, chained and unmoved, I followed the proper procedure to have it removed. I had no knowledge of any covert operations, nor was I informed that the vehicle belonged to any government agency. Frankly, I believe I was misled. That was when I stood up. Misled," I said loudly. "You cut the lock off a federal vehicle. You towed it without authorization. And you bragged about it on Facebook." There was a wave of murmurs. Karen shot me a glare, but I didn't sit down. I walked to the front of the room, pulled out a small USB drive, and handed it to the community center's IT guy, who was already standing by the projector like he'd been waiting for this moment all week. The screen flickered to life. First came the ring cam footage. Karen slicing the lock, gesturing to the tow truck, laughing as it drove off. Then came the Facebook screenshots, one by one. Her posts about taking action, her mocking comments about military cosplay, and the one where she proudly declared, "Sometimes you have to break the rules to keep the streets clean." The room went silent. One of the board members, a man named Greg who had always looked vaguely terrified of Karen, cleared his throat and whispered something to the person next to him. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. She turned back to the crowd, her voice slightly more strained now. "Okay, so perhaps I was misinformed about the ownership of the vehicle. But the vehicle was clearly violating HOA standard. And the bylaws give me the authority." "No, they don't," said a voice from the side of the room. Everyone turned. It was Detective Sasha Lynn. She stepped forward calmly, holding a thick folder. "We've reviewed the HOA charter, the removal procedures, and the documentation, or lack thereof. Not only did you bypass the board, you failed to notify any enforcement agency, used an unlicensed tow company, and relocated the vehicle to an unauthorized storage site you've apparently been operating without community consent." Karen opened her mouth, but Sasha wasn't finished. "Furthermore, the property in question was part of a sanctioned joint task force operation. Your actions compromised months of surveillance, damaged sensitive equipment, and resulted in the premature termination of an active case." Another wave of gasps and murmurs filled the room. Karen's face twitched, and she turned to the board for support, but they were all leaning away from her, like passengers trying to escape the splash zone. Greg suddenly stood up and spoke. "I'd like to make a motion to suspend Linda Farthington from her position as HOA president pending an internal investigation and legal review." Before Karen could respond, another board member raised a hand and said, "Seconded." A third member mumbled, "All in favor?" A unanimous chorus of "I" echoed through the room. Karen's mouth fell open. She looked stunned, as if this outcome had never even occurred to her in the worst of her nightmares. "You can't do this," she said, voice rising. "This is a power grab. I built this HOA. I've served this community for 6 years. And destroyed it in one afternoon," I said, stepping back beside Sasha. Karen tried to compose herself, flipping through her clipboard as if she could paperwork her way out of this disaster. Then, in a move so audacious it stunned even the legal observers, she pulled out a letter and waved it in the air. This is a cease and desist order filed by my attorney against the local police department and Mr. Jacobs for entrapment, defamation, and emotional distress. You'll all be hearing from my legal team very soon." Sasha calmly stepped forward and took the letter, glanced at it, then handed it back. "That lawyer, Trent Maxwell? We're familiar with him. He's already under investigation for misconduct in 3 other HOA-related lawsuits. Good luck." At that point, Karen realized she was alone. Even the people who had always supported her, the ones who had backed her crusades against lawn ornaments and mailboxes that weren't regulation beige, were silent. Rick leaned over and whispered, "Ding dong, the witch is cooked." She stormed out of the room, but not before barking, "You haven't heard the last of this," over her shoulder. After she was gone, the atmosphere shifted. People started to breathe again. Someone actually clapped. And then another. Soon the whole room was cheering. It was surreal. A spontaneous standing ovation for the downfall of a tyrant wrapped in HOA authority. Sasha leaned over to me and said, "We'll be forwarding the file to the DA. There will be charges. Maybe not all federal, but she's not walking away clean." I nodded, but I was still trying to absorb the fact that it was finally happening. For months, Karen had treated everyone like pawns in her weird suburban monarchy. And now, one act of arrogance, cutting a lock and towing a Jeep, had exposed everything. As the meeting broke up, I noticed Greg lingering near the back. He walked over awkwardly, scratching his head. "Hey, listen," he said. "Sorry about all this. We were afraid to stand up to her. She threatened to fine me for having a flag on my porch once." I told him it was okay. Fear was Karen's greatest weapon. But once it was gone, she had nothing left. That night, I slept like a rock. No sirens, no flashing lights, no angry emails about my garage door color. But I knew the battle wasn't completely over. Karen still had lawyers, and she wasn't the type to fade quietly into obscurity. But now, she was off the throne. And the neighborhood? For the first time in years, it had a chance to breathe. Within 48 hours of the HOA coup, the story blew up faster than I ever expected. It started when Rick uploaded the ring footage to Reddit under the r/entitled people subreddit with the caption, "HOA Karen cuts lock to impound my neighbor's Jeep. Didn't know it belonged to a federal task force." It hit the front page in 2 hours. By lunchtime, the video had over 2 million views, and by nightfall, Karen's face was plastered across TikTok, YouTube, and even one guy's angry Twitter thread where he called her suburbia's most dangerous tyrant. News vans rolled into the neighborhood like we were ground zero for HOA warfare, and people actually drove in from other towns just to get selfies in front of the infamous Jeep, which the police had since returned to me, scratches and all. The funny part? That Jeep had gone from being a visual nuisance to a local celebrity. Someone even made a parody GoFundMe titled, "Save the Tactical Jeep," and, jokingly, people donated enough to pay for a brand new coat of paint. I went with matte black. Fitting, given the Jeep had now become a rolling symbol of Karen's downfall. But underneath the jokes and memes, the situation was still serious. The surveillance gear had been destroyed, which set back months of police work. The task force was still trying to recover from the disruption, and Karen, despite being suspended from her HOA throne, was far from done causing chaos. A few days after the meeting, Karen re-emerged with all the subtlety of a wrecking ball. She showed up in a wrinkled suit outside the local courthouse, holding a press conference no one asked for, flanked by her slippery new attorney, Trent Maxwell. The same guy Sasha warned me about. Trent was a cartoon character of a lawyer, slicked back hair, oversized sunglasses, and the kind of smirk you'd only see on a man who once got a parking ticket dismissed by threatening to sue the DMV. He claimed Karen was the real victim, alleging that the police had failed to label the Jeep as official property, that I had deliberately baited her, and that the HOA bylaws gave her immunity from any municipal or federal repercussions. It was such a stretch, even the news anchor covering it laughed midway through her segment. The legal backlash came swiftly. The district attorney's office filed formal charges: unauthorized towing, destruction of property, obstruction of an investigation, and tampering with surveillance equipment. The feds weren't charging her yet, but they sent a blistering letter to the HOA, stating their operations were compromised and demanding full cooperation with ongoing investigations. The HOA board, still shaken from the public implosion, issued a formal apology and began fast-tracking reforms. Greg stepped in as interim president, and the first thing he did was announce the dissolution of Karen's beloved violation committee. People clapped. Literally. On the street. Like it was a block party. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. Her attorney filed a countersuit against the HOA, the city, the police department, and, bizarrely, me, claiming I had lured her into misconduct. Her argument, apparently, was that by legally parking a government vehicle on my own property and securing it with a visible lock, I had somehow enticed her into committing a crime. The judge took one look at the case and kicked it so hard out of court that even the courthouse clerk was smirking. But the damage had been done, at least to Karen's reputation. That's when the internet took over. Karen memes exploded online. One showed her photoshopped into a Grand Theft Auto screen, bolt cutters in hand, with the caption, "Mission failed. Federal charges incoming." Another turned her press conference into a rap remix, auto-tuning her words into, "I didn't know it was federal." TikTok creators reenacted the ring footage, complete with dramatic lighting and slow-mo effect. She was viral, but not in the way she had ever hoped. Her name became synonymous with entitled overeat. Teenagers who didn't even live in HOA communities started calling their strict parents Karen Farthingtons. But amidst the chaos, there was something strangely therapeutic happening in the neighborhood. People started talking more, laughing again. It was like the iron grip of petty rules and veiled threats had been lifted. Lawn chairs popped up on porches. Flags flew. Kids drew chalk murals on sidewalks without fear of fines. For the first time since I'd moved in, it felt like a community. Rick, ever the opportunist, decided to launch a website, HOAwatchdog.net. With the help of some of the other neighbors, he began compiling resources for people harassed by overreaching associations. His site gained traction fast, especially after he posted a detailed timeline of the Jeep incident, complete with video evidence, legal documents, and a merchandise section that included Team Jeep mugs and a t-shirt with Karen's infamous parking note printed on the back. As for the Jeep itself, the task force eventually replaced the damaged surveillance gear. To my surprise, they gave me the newer model to keep. Officer Melendez told me it was a token of appreciation, though it didn't quite erase the sting of the operation falling apart. Still, when they handed me the upgraded vehicle, complete with reinforced panels, blackout tech, and new internal systems, I couldn't help but laugh. Karen hated the old one. Wait till she sees this beast. But the final twist didn't come until a week later, when the HOA's insurance provider conducted an internal audit. Turns out, Karen had been submitting expense reports without approval for years. She'd used HOA funds to pay for towing fees, private contractors, even her personal printer ink. Thousands of dollars misused, and all buried in vague line items labeled administrative recovery. The audit results were forwarded to the authorities, and another investigation was opened, this time for embezzlement. I was sitting on my porch when Greg walked up and handed me a copy of the report. He looked tired but relieved. "She's done," he said. "The state's coming in next week. Might dissolve the whole HOA entirely unless we restructure everything from scratch." I asked him what he thought the neighborhood would do if the HOA was gone for good. He shrugged. "Maybe we just go back to being neighbors." As simple as it sounded, it hit hard. Because that's what it had all come down to. One woman's obsession with control, twisted into a system that let her run wild. And one stupid, bold move, cutting a lock on the wrong Jeep, had unraveled the whole thing. Later that night, I rolled the new Jeep into the driveway. Rick had helped me paint a small custom tag under the rear bumper. It read, Eyesore Number 1. I parked it just where the old one used to be, front and center, full tactical view. Couple of kids rode by on bikes and gave me a thumbs up. I saluted them back. Karen hadn't been seen since her last press debacle. Her lawyer stopped returning calls. Her house went dark. And rumor had it she was trying to sell, though no one wanted to buy the home of the woman who went to war with a jeep and lost to the internet. Justice had come not just with subpoenas, but with memes, neighborly support, and one seriously stubborn vehicle. The final curtain dropped on a warm Saturday morning, the kind of day where everything feels just a little too calm before something big happens. I was sipping coffee on the porch, scrolling through the latest Karen memes, when I saw the convoy. 3 black SUVs, 1 sedan, and a pair of uniformed marshals stepping out like they were arriving on a movie set. They moved with quiet authority, knocking once on Karen's door, then waiting exactly 30 seconds before stepping back and announcing their presence. She didn't answer. She probably knew what was coming. The marshals didn't waste time. A locksmith was already on standby, and within minutes the door swung open. A few neighbors peered through their blinds while others simply came outside with popcorn in hand. It was happening. The arrest warrant had been signed, and Karen Farthington was officially being taken into custody. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. When she finally appeared in the doorway, her hair was messy, and her red blazer was wrinkled, like she'd been sleeping in it for days. She clutched a manila folder as if it could still somehow prove her innocence. But all that was left was the slow, shameful walk to the waiting vehicle. Her hands were cuffed in front, and the look on her face wasn't rage anymore, it was disbelief. As if she still thought this was all just a misunderstanding, a small mistake that had somehow spiraled into national humiliation and multiple felony charges. But it wasn't a mistake. It was 100 small choices stacked one on top of the other, each one a little more entitled than the last, until eventually she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. When the marshals drove off, a cheer broke out across the block. No one had organized it, but it happened anyway. Loud, spontaneous, and oddly cathartic. Rick even set off a couple small fireworks left over from the 4th of July. Sasha Lynn showed up later that afternoon to debrief a few residents, and she stopped by my porch to let me know the final charge sheet. Obstruction, tampering with government property, operating an unlicensed towing operation, misuse of community funds, and suspected embezzlement. It read more like a movie plot than a case summary. But the legal side was only part of it. The HOA itself had effectively collapsed. Half the board had resigned, and the other half had voted to dissolve the organization entirely rather than face a class action lawsuit from the residents. With no formal structure left, the bylaws Karen once wielded like holy scripture were now nothing more than shredded paper in a forgotten binder. Greg helped oversee the transition, but even he admitted most people were just happy to be rid of the rules. The violations stopped. The passive-aggressive notes disappeared. People planted whatever flowers they wanted, painted their mailboxes bright colors, and nobody cared. The neighborhood finally felt like it belonged to the people who lived in it, not some miniature dictatorship masquerading as community governance. As a strange thank-you gesture, the residents pitched in to gift me a custom metal sign that read, "Reserved for Tactical Eyesore." We bolted it to the curb in front of my house, and it became a local landmark. Even the mailman asked to take a picture with it. But the biggest surprise came the following weekend, when Officer Melendez and Sasha Lynn returned, not in uniform but in casual clothes, wearing huge grins and holding a giant set of keys. They led me around the back of the house where I saw it. The maintenance garage, once used as Karen's private impound lot, had been auctioned off by the city after the investigation. And guess who had quietly purchased it on behalf of the community? The task force. But they didn't want to keep it. Melendez turned to me and said, "It's yours now. We figured if anyone deserves to decide what gets parked here, it's the guy who had his Jeep stolen by the HOA president during a federal operation." At first, I thought he was joking. But then he handed me the deed, signed and sealed. I had to sit down just to process it. The irony was poetic. The very place where Karen had dragged my Jeep without permission was now mine, legally and forever. I decided to turn it into something useful, a small community hub with workbenches, a mini repair bay, and a wall of donated tools. We called it the garage, and anyone could use it. Veterans, teens working on car projects, dads fixing bike. No permits, no permissions, no fines. And to christen the new space, the task force organized a little surprise of their own. A week later, the block was lined with Jeeps, military, civilian, vintage, and custom-built. Vets from around the county showed up, along with officers from the department, and we led a slow, honking parade through the neighborhood. Kids waved flags. Parents cheered. Rick live-streamed the whole thing, and it went viral almost immediately. At the head of the parade was my new Jeep, polished and tactical, with the phrase "Community Watchdog" stenciled across the hood. We ended the drive at the garage, where Sasha gave a short speech and handed me a plaque that read, "In appreciation for keeping your cool when your HOA went full villain." It made everyone laugh, but the weight behind it was real. This whole thing could have gone sideways, could have gotten ugly. But instead, it became something better. Proof that when people stand up to nonsense, even the most ridiculous abuse of power can be undone. Karen eventually took a plea deal. No jail time, but she was ordered to pay restitution to the HOA, fined by the state, and banned from serving on any association board for the next 20 years. She sold her house quietly and left in the dead of night. No one said goodbye. No one cared. In the months that followed, the neighborhood flourished. We held barbecues, planted trees, and started calling ourselves the Eyesore Estates as an inside joke. The signs stayed out front. The Jeep stayed parked. And Karen? She became a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without empathy leads nowhere good. Looking back, it's still hard to believe everything spiraled out of something as simple as a parked Jeep. But maybe that's the lesson. Sometimes it doesn't take a massive crime to expose a toxic system. Sometimes it just takes one bad decision made by someone who thinks the rules don't apply to them. Karen thought she was protecting the neighborhood, but the truth is, she was the one threatening it all along. Now, every time I start up the Jeep and hear that engine purr, I smile. Because it's not just a vehicle anymore. It's a symbol, a reminder, and a damn good story. One I'll be telling for years.